morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Erik Bush. I am the CEO and founder of Demand Driven Technologies and delighted to be presenting you this update on building agility into your supply chain if you're in the food and beverage industry. We have other audience members coming in, so before we get into the content, I'll just cover off on a couple key housekeeping items. First of all, we're going to be recording the session. We do that to make it available to those who aren't able to attend the actual live webinar. That link will be available after the session for you to review, share with your colleagues and the like. We also will be distributing the PowerPoint presentation we'll be using as part of the discussion today. There is a question and answer tool in your Zoom panel that you can utilize to ask questions. We keep the audience on mute because that allows for better audio quality, but that doesn't mean we're not interested in answering your questions. So please utilize that, and we'll cover those near the end of the session. Also, we'll be distributing links to our upcoming user conference. We have an event coming up at the end of May here in Atlanta, Georgia, and would love to meet with you face-to-face if you have the opportunity and are interested. Those links will be available to register for the session. So with that, let's go ahead and get into the content. We did a session 2 weeks ago with Barry Anderson, who is responsible for the supply chain in Coca-Cola Beverages Africa. He's based in South Africa, but they're managing their business in several countries, 9 country operations across sub-Saharan Africa. And I thought he shared some very interesting insights about some of the challenges that people or companies in the food and beverage space are facing. And we're going to use those as a bit of a backdrop. I'm going to go through a couple of the issues that he talked about last week or last session to kind of frame this. And then what we're going to get into is a discussion around how the application of demand-driven MRP concepts can aid and really put you in a better position to manage some of the typical scenarios we find in the food and beverage arena. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Let's just talk a little bit about kind of the backdrop, what are kind of the framing issues in the industry. First of all, we've seen this over and over again with any of the F&B clients that we've been working with, that there is this constant shift in the markets as new vendors come online, as new products are introduced, new product categories, you name it. There's quite a bit of innovation going on in any of the consumer markets, but especially around food and beverage. And that creates its own set of challenges, especially for some of the established vendors like Coca-Cola. There has also been in recent years more and more pressure from the customers and the market on product freshness, shelf life considerations, the born-on dates of the products that you're consuming and things like that. And that puts another wrinkle on the environment that obviously needs to be thought through and considered, and your supply chain obviously has to support. Because of all this competitive pressure, companies are seeing substantial increases in product proliferation, meaning that they have more and more SKUs in their portfolio. That may be different pack sizes, new flavors, new offerings, you name it. But suffice to say that the number of items that they're managing on the finished goods and the raw and pack side are increasing at a substantial rate. And at the same time, there's corporate pressures to try to lean out staffing and planning personnel at both the planning and operations level. Barry talked a bit about turnover. Obviously, the pandemic has had a big impact on, headcount and resourcing across all the different industries. But some of those challenges, especially when you consider the product proliferation issues in the F&B arena, creates kind of a separating issue here where we have more and more items to manage, but fewer and fewer people to help manage that complexity. So those were kind of the framing issues. And what we utilized then was a couple illustrations around things that are kind of the consequence of this in the food and beverage space. One is kind of a Pareto curve. If you look at our finished good items in this example, you can see the first 20 to 30% of the items are making up the bulk of the revenue or the utilization usage in terms of daily, demand and sales for those items. And then as we get out to the rest of the SKUs, there's very little incremental contribution. At the very end here, there are some items that are not moving at all in a given market. And so this really creates a challenge, because how do we manage such a wide range of activity? Your steady runners over here on the left have a certain expectation in terms of the volumes. They're kind of the bread and butter, if you will, for the business. And we obviously have to understand that as we move further right on this Pareto curve, we start to encounter some other issues. One of them has been forecast accuracy. And Barry talked about how the steady runners were a little bit easier to forecast. This is an example of the week by week variance in terms of forecast versus actual volume. From a customer of ours in the food and beverage space, you can see that virtually every week there is a variance somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% to the high side, and up to 200% on the low side. So quite a bit of noise in the system in terms of the forecast signal that companies are working with. On the slow mover side, you see actually more variation, more deviance or deviation to the forecasted signal. So the question is, can we really rely on forecasting as the primary way of generating our resupply requirements and driving our supply chain? We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. We also looked at the correlation between our fast movers and slow movers relative to the variation in their demand signals. So this is plotting a regression curve of what is the levels of variation seen in the actual consumption of the item. And as we get to the right here on the slower movers, you see higher and higher levels of coefficient of variation. And that's indicative of the fact that not only are the slower movers harder to forecast, but the actual demand pulses we get from the market become more volatile and more noisy, meaning that we have to ensure that we've got appropriate protections in there for those items as well. When we look at the operational side of things, batch sizing, we see that as we get to the slower end of the pipeline here, these are make items, and you can see we've kind of plateaued out here in the second half of the portfolio, that the batch sizes, when expressed in days of supply, become much, much larger. They kind of double in size, if you will. And that's due to things like setup times. What are my economics from an efficiency standpoint? If I'm going to set up to run one of these slow movers, I want to make enough product that I don't have to break my schedules again to run this slow mover very often. And obviously there's an impact here when we do this on what our shelf life considerations could be. So we've got to keep all of these factors in mind, and this can become quite difficult to get these factors organized in a good way if you don't have the right tools available to you to sort those out. And then finally, from the standpoint of inventory turnover rates and the like, as we get further out to the right in the Pareto curve, we see that our turnover rate or our days on hand are doubling or more. That means our inventory is moving at a slower rate. We're sitting on more working capital requirements for those items, and have to keep that in mind as we plan our way forward. Now, I'm not suggesting anything about portfolio management. That's not my space. That's really driven by company strategies around innovation, your brand, what you're trying to do in the market. But whether you're a finished goods producer or a contract manufacturer, whatever, you're in some way are dealing with this curve and the impacts that it has on both your planning and your production environments. And what we're trying to do here in this session is just make the connection between how demand-driven MRP works and how you can get benefits from that in both the planning and the operational dimensions. So let's ask ourselves a set of questions and then see what we can do to kind of address these through the application of some of these techniques. How do we insulate ourselves from noise in the forecast? And the foundation of that, as you'll see here, is the adoption of true demand-driven concepts. We'll spend a couple minutes talking about the base principles there. How do we deal with items that have substantially higher levels of variation? Whether they're fast or slow movers, we need to understand how variation is going to impact us, because it's actually managing the variation that is going to have more to do with our success almost than just what our forecast is. How can we determine what our good batch sizes would be for slower moving items less frequent production runs. How do we make those settings in mind for shelf life considerations, batch efficiencies, and other factors like that? And then can we get a better understanding of the impact that slow movers will have on our inventory turnover rates, and what mitigations can we do there to make sure that we're turning over our working capital at a good rate? So let's spend a few minutes now. We'll introduce the concepts of DDMRP for those of you who are well-trained and seasoned in this. This will be a little bit repetitive, but I'm going to go through it rather quickly. And we're going to start by just investigating what are the problems with MRP from the beginning. The conventional planning that's in place in the market is material requirements planning. It's a pretty simple concept in reality, and it starts with the following logic, that based on your forecast, what is your demand going to be? It's going to backward schedule what you need to buy, what you need to then manufacture or assemble, what you need to package and distribute to meet that forecasted demand. And in reality, it is simply a large calculator that considers lead times. It phase backward schedules all of these things in such a manner that you should be able to have the material, the end items ready when that demand arrives. But there's some critical assumptions here that I think we need to think about and investigate and understand. First and foremost, it assumes that the demand is known or that the forecast is accurate. And when I talk to clients and prospects and pretty much anybody in supply chain, and I ask about how reliable is your forecast at the item level, not at the aggregate, at the item level, because you and I buy items, we don't buy categories. You know, the feedback is very mixed. Some people will say, yeah, well, in aggregate, we're getting into the 90s, but at the item level, most companies are down in the 50 to 60% range. So it's a very, very flawed assumption to think that material requirements planning is going to give us good results if we are inherently using a noisy signal. The second core assumption there is that there's not going to be any variation. All the supplies will come on time. Our lead times will be achieved. There isn't going to be any variation in the signal. We all know that that's not a reality either, right? That there has been massive issues, especially through the pandemic, but even in a normal environment, variation is the enemy of any supply chain. And so we have to question the validity of that assumption that's foundational to the way the MRP logic works. And then finally, your item master data has to be accurate. And I don't think there's any escaping that. If you're trying to get value out of a system, you have to have good data in it. So let's take that as a given. No matter what we do, we need to have good data. But I think we can explore and understand whether these first two, there's a different strategy that we can deploy to help address these flawed assumptions that MRP is relying on. So what's so unique about DDMRP? The whole idea here is that it is a planning system based on the most accurate signal we're going to find, which is true consumption. If we were able to align to the true demand in the market, not our estimate of the demand, but the actual orders coming in, by any stretch of the imagination, we are going to be utilizing a more accurate signal. And so if we could plan that way, we should be in a better place. But the question that always comes up is, I can't wait that long. I can't wait for today's orders to come in because I have to ship in 2 days. And my cumulative lead times are much longer than that. And so therefore, I have to start activity well in advance of that time of need. And my only way of being able to do that is through a forecast. And this is where we kind of challenge the assumption that maybe there's a way we could ensure the stock is available so that you can pace to that more accurate signal without relying on the forecast. And that concept comes to life through something we call a demand-driven MRP buffer. They are designed to ensure that the material will always be available. And I'll show you some illustrations about this when we get into the software here in a minute. If the material is available and we can rely on that to be the fact, then we can utilize this more accurate demand signal. And I think everybody can kind of get their head around, boy, that would be a better place because we know how much issues we've had with our forecasts in the past. So how is the DDMRP buffer set up? Well, we start with a yellow zone. It's the level of consumption over the time it takes you to replenish that material. So in other words, if I have an item that has a 10-day lead time from order release to order receipt, 10 days will occur, and it's being used at 10 per day, then my yellow zone will have 100 units in it. I order it top of yellow, the material should arrive when I get to bottom of yellow, which sounds very simplistic, and anyone who has been around supply chain would know, well, that's often not going to happen, right? Because either the consumption will come faster or slower than that, or the lead time may not be achieved. And that's where variation comes into play here. And this is where our red zone becomes that protection. The more variation we incur, either through demand signal variation or supplier reliability variation, batch schedule variation, you name it, the more those things impact us, the more protective size we need in our red zone to ensure that we are going to be able to manage that variation. If we do that well and have that constant availability, again, we're going to be able to start with a more accurate signal. So if we can figure out a different way, and so instead of relying on a forecast, if we can rely on buffer settings being accurately developed, then arguably we can utilize that actual demand coming in, and that will put us in a much, much better place. The final element in a buffer is the green zone, which is going to be sized based on typical order policy, either the minimum order quantity, minimum batch size, or an average order frequency. How often do we want to run this product on our production line? And we'll show you some illustrations of this in the software here shortly. The good news is we order from top of yellow, we order up to top of green, so we can ensure we respect those kind of parameters. The good news also is that when we plan above over top, the green zone, we are now over top of green, and we have visibility to when we are over compensating or over planning. And this helps us from a governance standpoint ensure that we're planning per the recommendations of the system. We get great transparency on that, and that's a very, very helpful tool from the management system standpoint. The buffers will flex over time based on changes in rates of demand. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the next chart, but the idea here is that our planning line will hover between top of yellow and top of green, while our inventories will hover between typically in the middle of the yellow zone, dipping into the red on occasion. Again, the whole goal here is constant availability. And if we can make that happen, many things change in our environment. So let's talk about the net flow equation. And this concept about net flow was borrowed heavily from some of the foundational thinking behind DDMRP based on theory of constraints. One of the principles of TOC is wait as long as you can before you take an action, because your action will be more accurate. So the idea of the net flow equation very much is trying to bring that to life. This is how we make our planning decisions. We take our on-hand inventory, we add to that our open supply orders that are coming in, not the blanket PO, but the actual releases of material that are coming to our buffer. And we take from that the sales orders or demand due today or in the past. Today or in the past. So the idea here is we're going to be able to respond to what comes in today. We may look out into the future if there is something called a spike, which would be a demand order several days from now within the parts lead time that is big enough that if we didn't compensate for it, it might jeopardize this constant availability that I've been talking about. But other orders in the future that don't reach that threshold, we would not. And so this is just a defensive technique. Again, make sure we've got constant availability, but plan to the, wait as long as possible philosophy that I'm talking about. So our net flow line is going to hover between top of green, dipping into the yellow zone. Over time, you'll see typically a seesaw pattern like this, and we'll see some of that in the simulations I'll be showing you here in a minute. Our inventory line then will be hovering between the typically the middle part of the yellow zone, dipping into the red on occasion. The big difference here is, unlike safety stock, which is an artificial floor that MRP utilizes as a planned down to level, the red zones in a DDMRP buffer are there to absorb variation. So even though we may be in the red zone, it doesn't mean that we kick off a new expedited order or anything like that. It raises visibility for the planners to intervene if and when necessary. And there's great visibility in the solution to allow you to do that. But when you properly manage your buffer, you manage per the parameters on the net flow standpoint, you're going to see your inventory progressing in a fashion like this. This is a great kind of behavior that's visual and illustrated in the software that gives users great confidence that they've got the settings set up correctly. And that's how we plan. Again, not to be redundant, but the goal here is let's use a more accurate signal, and let's also make sure that we're managing variation. Those were the two critical assumptions that MRP relies on that I think we all would agree aren't reliable, that they aren't stable. So we have to find other ways to working around those factors. Okay. So wanted to show some of the ideas here. We're going to go back to the Pareto curve. We're going to look at fast and slow movers. We're going to look at how we utilize red zone settings to address levels of variation. We're going to show how you can utilize some of those planning metrics to optimize your loads, like for a production planning example. We'll show you how you can monitor material availability and shelf life in the solution. These are also key elements of our planning challenge. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we can utilize rough cut capacity planning to get a better understanding of how we can start to work towards a more stable level loading of our production environment. Okay, so we'll go back to our Pareto curve one more time. This is for production line, an illustration we'll see in our demo environment here. You can see the top 2 or 3 items here are making up the vast majority of the run rate here that we're looking at. There's a set of slower moving items that really don't contribute an awful lot. And what we wanted to talk about was looking at how do we utilize order cycle here. And so when you look at your distribution curve like this, you can say, on my steady runners, these are the bread and butter products that we're selling into the market. Perhaps we would use a 7-day order cycle. And what I mean by that is we're going to size our green zone to represent 7 days worth of demand, meaning that we would expect to run in production this product every week to replenish that buffer. This middle group that has slower movement, but is still moving rather quickly and represent a good portion of our demand, maybe we'll be in the 14-day order cycle range. That means we're going to expect the buffer to signal a resupply order once every 2 weeks or thereabout. And then finally, on the slow movers, let's think about phasing those in and doing a production run on those every month, once a month as an example. And this way we can utilize this kind of thinking to organize our portfolio in such a manner that the buffers themselves are going to trigger that kind of recurring replenishment on the desired order cycle that we're looking to get to. So I'm going to jump out of the PowerPoint here now for a minute. Excuse me, and go back into the software. So we're going to go over here to the workbench. I'm going to pull up a save view I've got for my make items sorted by their EDU, or the effective daily usage. What's their run rate per week? And you can see our products here that have their effective daily usage sorted high to low. We've organized our order cycle values here at 7 days for the top several items, 21 days for a couple, and 28 days just in this example. And what that's doing is sizing the green zone. So I'm going to go in and look at this one item here. And we'll be able to actually give you a visualization of what happens. So this is kind of the part details. You can see our buffer sizing. It's based, excuse me, on this 7-day order cycle override right here on the page. So it's taking 7 times EDU, and that's the size of the green zone. Okay. And so that really is telling us that we're going to take 7 times this figure of 1,442 per day. That's going to size our green zone accordingly. The top of the, or that's the zone size right there, is the 10,000 units. The top of the zone, which is our top of green position, is 29,000 units. You can see our average days supply is going to be 10 days at an average inventory level of 14,745 units. How is that determined? Well, per the DDMRP method, we take all of the red zone, I actually show the illustration here. All of the red zone, plus we add half of the green zone. Why is that? Well, we order at top of yellow, we order up to top of green. So on average, half of that supply is available, and that's what determines what our expected average inventory level is going to be. That's a useful figure, and we'll talk about that as well when we think about shelf life considerations and the like. Now, let's say, because this one was kind of in the middle of the workbench in terms of its usage, that we wanted to evaluate switching it to perhaps a 14-day order cycle override. You see now that our green zone has doubled in size. We were at 10,000 units before. Now we're at 20,000. Now it means that we would expect to run this product in production once every other week. And we can look at our portfolio of products, typically like in a bottling example, you've got different pack sizes that can run on some lines and others on others. You're going to have a portfolio of products. You're going to look at them. You're going to also have flavor sequences, things like that you need to respect. This would help you get your portfolio organized so that kind of on a rhythmic basis, once a week, once every 2 weeks, you can set your schedule and know that your buffer stocks are going to be set up correctly. We'll just go ahead and make one more edit here, and we'll turn that up to a 28-day cycle. And now you can see that the green zone is now up to 40,000 units. And now our days covered has expanded from 10 days up to 21 days. Still, in most of the food products that I've been around, that will be a very short duration. So we're going to have plenty of shelf life left over, obviously, maybe not in milk products, but in most categories, that would be adequate turnover rate that you wouldn't have to worry about shelf life considerations. So again, what we're using is an order cycle value to generate different views of what our green zone sizing will be and what our frequency of ordering will be. Now I'm going to go over to our simulation tool and make an illustration of this. This is that same item, 154284. This is looking out at a 39-week simulation using its current buffer setting and that order cycle override of 7 days. If we wanted to see what its pattern would be for 14 days, we're going to simply make a change here. I want you to notice something here. We said we planned from top of yellow up to top of green. You'll see some orders here that don't get all the way to top of green, and that's because our minimum order quantity and order multiple sizes have to be respected. So in some cases, we can't get all the way to top of green because of our order policy parameters. In beverages, that may be a concentrate kit that you're going to use all of the concentrate. So your minimum batch size is going to be roughly that 5,000 units. Let's now change this, and we'll go up to, let's go to a 14-day setting, and we'll rerun the simulation here. Now what you see is that our order intervals are much less frequent, right? We've got quite a few orders. Every time our net flow goes up, that indicates a new order has been generated from top of yellow up to top of green, again, respecting order policy parameters and like. You can see how our inventory level is performing over time as well. We get 100% service level. Our average inventory value is around 19,000 units. We obviously start out with a bit too much supply at the beginning of the scenario. Over here, we've got a relatively slow period of demand, but we are largely working within the parameters that we want to achieve. We can then change this to a 28-day order cycle, rerun the simulation, and now we see half as many orders. In fact, in this case, I think we end up with around 9 orders placed in year 1, 5, 6, 7, 8 orders. So even though we're on once a month, actually, because we've got some period of slower demand coming up, we're going to have fewer orders. And that's okay. We're still respecting this concept of pacing to the actual demand that comes in. This is a forward-looking simulation, but it allows us to understand whether or not those order cycle settings that we're creating are going to give us the kind of planning parameters and planning behavior that we're looking for to get to a better place. So again, that was an example of looking at how we can utilize order cycle parameters here to deal with fast and slow movers. Now let's go and take a look at red zone settings. We know that as we go through time and we have items with slower and slower rate of usage, they tend to have higher levels of variability. And so what we'll do is look at how we can change red zone settings. This is an example where we simply changed the buffer assignment to cover a higher level red zone to cover this type of variation. And this is very useful analysis. There's a bunch of work we're doing in this arena that we've patented that's around bringing a lot more AI ML kind of functionality to help determine what those actual red zone parameters ought to be. We can go back to the simulation or the workbench. This case, we've sorted now and created a different view. We've looked at our line 2 items. This is it's a different kind of production line that can handle different pack sizes and the like. And we're going to look at item B31 here. And it has a buffer sizing that is utilizing a, you'll see the buffer zone setting here. It's using a M12C. And if we change the setting like to a higher variation, the coding in the system is a make part with a short lead time. With a 3 would be a higher level of variation. And what you'll see when I select this is that our red zone is going to change height. And now our red zone has gone up to 13 days of coverage, whereas when we were on the M12C, I think we were down around, the red zone size was around 6 days of coverage, 6.5. So by changing our buffer settings, we can ensure that we have more safety. Let's go and look at a simulation of this part now. You can see here's its simulation. Out here, we've got some stock exposures. We've got some periods of heavy demand that are expected later on in the year. We can go in now and evaluate if we utilize this M13 order cycle basis buffer zone, will we get enough coverage to protect ourselves during that heavy demand period? Maybe there's a promotional event or something coming on out there. So when we run it, it doesn't completely resolve it, but it helps address this this dip in inventory level considerably. So the tools are there, with your buffer settings on order cycle to set your green zones to give you good kind of recurring production rate. And then on the other end, utilizing different buffer settings to ensure that we're covering the kind of variation that we're likely to experience in our forward-looking horizon. All right, let's go back to the lens. Now what we want to take a look at is what can we do to think about how we optimize our loads? What if all the buffers are signaling in a manner that's not quite optimal for a production run? Maybe we're going to see a little bit more demand in a given period than we'd like to work with. We're going to go back to the workbench. We're going to look up our make items for line 1. And this time it's going to be sorted in the normal order you would expect to see. Whoops, that's the EDU sort. That's not the one I want. I must have deleted it. Uh-oh. Well, no worries. We can simply change out this sort, put it in order of priority, and we are good to go. So we stack them the way we normally would. Anything in red or yellow will have an order recommendation against it. And before we show you the load optimization, what we want to do is talk about the fact that we can look at different packaging units. I can go in and modify my current view, and I can show it in a variety of different unit of measure dimensions. I'm going to switch this over to pallets just for the time being, because if this was supplied materials, we could look at what our pallet load would be, and we can optimize loading accordingly. We're not going to do that example. We're going to use hours because these are make items for our production line 1. I'm going to switch it back to hours, but you can imagine having a number of different dimensions in here. Now we've set it to hours. We can see that for this line, for that pack size, we are estimating 122 hours of production based on the buffer requirements for these recommended orders, based on the net flow equation for each of those. That means that perhaps, let's say we've got a 120-hour schedule. We're going 5 days a week, 24 hours a day. We know that we really can't get all 120 hours out. We're going to have to offset that. So what we can do then is go ahead and say, let's let the system manage and do a little bit of a smoothing on the orders for us. And we're going to assume that we're going to have 110 hours of production available. And what would happen here is that it will optimize the load. And it comes up with a solution that says we're going to use 109.31 hours. It's respecting all of my minimum and multiple order policy dimensions. It's generating a revised recommendation, and it's showing us that in fact, this item, which wasn't getting an order recommendation till now, but had the deepest penetration and was still in the green zone, is going to get bumped up because it's starting to get low on inventory, and we would want to get this one included in our production run to help cover some potential demand there. So you have the ability to generate the system load. You can then, if you still want to make some further tweaks, you can make edits and adjustments to those orders. So this can be done based on a packaging. If you're looking for pallet loads coming in on containers, or less than truckload from your vendors and the like, you can apply it to your production environment by loading what your run rates are per unit. And that would allow you to get a better understanding of how many hours of production you're going to be generating supply orders for. So we've kind of connected the dots between setting order cycles so that I get a recurring signal for when to resupply based on a desired frequency. We've looked at how we can protect ourselves with variation using those red zone settings. And now we've also connected the dots into how we can plan the replenishment orders that we do generate, so that the operation side of the house isn't screaming that you're asking for, another 5 hours on Friday night that aren't there, and it's going to bleed into Saturday from a production scheduling standpoint. So a lot of handy tools that we can bring to life to help address these kind of requirements. If you're satisfied with the orders, you would simply go in and go ahead and accept that solution. It would generate the recommended orders. They go into a basket that then gets pulled back into your ERP system, and you're off and running. Okay, we're going to stay on this one now. And what I want to talk a little bit about is having a visibility to material availability and shelf life. And we can see those dimensions as well in our workbench. So we're going to go back on here, and we're going to look for a given item here. And what we bring in is we bring in your lots and your batch information into the inventory file. And if inventory has an expiration date on it, it comes back into the system as a demand, because that's the date by which that inventory is no longer going to be good for us. And it would typically be based on how many days of remaining supply you need to make available for your customers. If you're selling beverages into the retail trade and the like, they're typically, the grocery chains are going to want to have at least 60 days of inventory or shelf life remaining on the item. So you would set your parameters to ensure that those are going to be respected and the like. Obviously, we know from our buffer sizing that we can see what our average days on hand would be. We're able to utilize that information here. Our expected average inventory is only 10 days of supply, so we know we're well within our shelf life parameters. But that really gives us a way to connect the dots between, did we set up our buffers well to meet those shelf life requirements? Can we organize those in an effective manner? Next thing we want to talk about was material availability. And here you can see that there's an availability flag on this order. It's looking at the recommended order, and it's going to look at the items within its bill of material and says that, hey, there is an item on our bill of material, which we can look at here quickly. It shows all the items in the bill. A label, a preform, and a concentrate kit here are the materials that are in the this product structure in the simple demo. When we look at the availability review, we see that we have this proposed demand for the 216,000 units that you would have seen on the workbench, which is greater than the on-hand available inventory that we have. That available inventory is going to be based on what is known as the running balance. So if there was open supply coming in for this label for this product, then it would be counted into the running balance if it was before this proposed order was going to run. So it's looking at the due date on the order, the requirement for the child part, and aligning those factors. So you've got good visibility. It could be that you know that the label is on the dock, we just haven't received it into inventory yet. We can go ahead and plan the production for this order, but it gives us a great sense of, that we've got things lined up in a manner that is going to fit that production order. Final topic I just want to touch on briefly here is this notion of rough cut capacity planning. DDMRP is a great method. Like any inventory planning method, they're typically not really often tied to what our capacity and production constraints are. So our solution provides rough cut and detailed production scheduling and planning. And this allows us to get a better sense of, are the projected supply requirements that we're generating going to be met through our environment? So again, we'll go back into the software and we'll go to our S&OP module, which helps us get a better understanding of that. Here we've turned and looked at the rough cut capacity planning view, and we're looking at it for 2 locations. I'm going to change my preferences here just for a second to include a second location, because many companies in beverage have some flexibility. They might be able to borrow production capacity at another site in their network, if in fact that was the case. We sorted on 2 bottlers. Now, one of the things that we have to understand is that any capacity planning has to tie back to what our schedules are. So we're going to open up our resource calendar and our resource editors. The resource editors, where we define the production resources we have. And so you can see there are 2 production lines. You'll notice that we have the ability to edit what type of a resource it is. And in our nomenclature, it's either a constraint, a resource, or a buffered resource. A constraint will be finitely scheduled. It's following the idea that only select resources within a given production environment should be considered as your constraint, very much along the lines of drum buffer rope from theory of constraint. Items that are resources, and you'll see that we've got a comparison here, will be infinitely scheduled. Sometimes it's very helpful to know how much capacity you actually need. So if you set it as a resource, you'll get kind of the unvarnished view of here's the peaks and valleys of when we need capacity, whereas a constraint is going to flatten and level load based on a fixed amount of capacity you have in a given weekly basis. Those are also influenced by our resource calendars. So we've set up, in this example, a bottler 2-shift operation where we've got 16 hours a day, and then we set what our week definitions are, and those are typically 5 days a week. As you can see over here, those are our standard calendars. We've got all sorts of flexibility to allow you to model shutdown periods like for holidays or maintenance periods on your production resources and the like. So you understand that when you're looking at your rough cut capacity planning view, it's already kind of being influenced by what your true available time is out on the shop floor. So in this case, we've got the same demand at line 2 in the bottler location, and in bottler 2, we have the same demand there. But in bottler 2, we're not constrained. So you can see our peak load here is going to be over 100%. And we can see that in looking at its resource load graph, that there are periods where we are well above the production capacity that we have. This is modeling the 80 hours a week that we have in a 2-shift operation. And it's the same demand for both patterns. In this case, we're looking at a finitely scheduled. So it's moving around. It's taking the peaks off, typically moving those earlier if there's time available, and then it will only move later if there's no way it can get there. And this is very important so that we can actually utilize this to make sure that we are setting our buffer parameters. We can model these scenarios by running different test cases to ensure that we look at, perhaps we could take some of the line production requirement off line 2 and move it onto line 1 if we had better availability. Both line 1s are running as unconstrained. You'll see that there's some peaks and valleys there. You've got great visibility to where those thresholds are. In our settings within the S&OP module, we can set how we want to signal those based on various levels of capacity. is our resource at 80% or 90%? You can set these to make sense for your environment. And what are those critical situations? And those flags will appear. You set a horizon as to how far out you want those signals to be alerting, and you can get good visibility on those factors as well. So with rough cut capacity planning, what we're trying to do is make sure they fit. Now, in certain cases, you'll have pre-built. We were working with a client last week up in Ohio that has some products that are heavily seasonally based around the holiday seasons of Easter and Christmas. And they actually have to start pre-building well in advance of that. And by utilizing the finitely scheduled load, you could take your forecast and it would tell you how far in advance you need to start production on that item. We've seen this in other cases in other countries and other client environments where certain products have a very steep, period of demand after which things are rather quiet. So they have limited capacity. They have to start pre-building well in advance of that to ensure that they're going to be able to keep up with those requirements. So quite a bit of flexibility at bringing together the operation side of the house with the material planning. And so when we use these tools in the right way, we can put ourselves in a situation where the system is doing more of the work for us. We've got our buffer set up to order roughly every third week if they're slower movers, every week if they're fast movers. We've configured those settings to make sure that we're protecting against variation. We've reconciled things like shelf life and material availability. And we've also got a way through rough cut capacity planning to make sure that we've brought all of those elements in line. On the detailed scheduling side that I mentioned, we can also respect things like grouping. In other words, let's get all the orders for the production line one grouped together. Let's put them in a flavor sequence. So the actual detailed schedule was, we start with this SKU, then this SKU, then this SKU, and the like. And it really works well in terms of automating, getting those schedules set up. And we also did the load optimization details that I showed you earlier. So kind of wrapping up here. Can we insulate ourselves from, challenging or inaccurate forecasts? I think we've seen over and over again, clients like Coca-Cola, Michelin, others in all sorts of different industries getting better results by getting away from having so much dependence on forecasts that are inherently inaccurate. How do we address items with higher levels of variation? We change our settings to ensure that our red zones are fat enough to deal with that. I mentioned that we have AI/ML technology that we'll be sharing at our user conference coming up here in May that is going to do that in a far more automated way and a reliable way for our users. Can we determine our batch sizes in the context of what makes sense from a production run standpoint? Can we set those order cycles in a fashion that will give us the right rate of frequency to make sure that we've got shelf life considerations being considered, but also, that we've kind of got that economic order quantity philosophy working for us as well. And then obviously you saw the expected average inventory level. We can go in knowing what we should expect to see in terms of what our inventory turnover rates will be, what our shelf life considerations will be, and the like. So quite a bit of, what I think of as tactile grip on our operating environment by the use of proper technique with our buffer zone settings and the DDMRP elements that are so useful. Once you get the hang of working with these, it starts to make a lot of these other more challenging questions a lot easier to get through. So with that, just a reminder, we have a user conference coming up here in Atlanta on May 24th and 25th. It's also going to be held as a hybrid event. So if you're not able to fly in and visit with us here in Atlanta, you'll be able to participate in the conference. There's going to be a whole range of case studies and, hot topic sessions and things like that. I think it's going to be a great experience for any of you who are able to participate. Would love to see you there. It's been a while since we've been able to get together face to face. So really looking forward to this event. Finally, there's also the ability, if you go to our website, the opportunity we'll do simulations for clients that are interested in taking a closer look at understanding how DDMRP can impact their inventory positions, their service levels, and the like. It's a free service that we offer prospective clients. It is quite informative. A lot of what you've seen in the software today can come to life and give you a better understanding of how this might address some of the challenges that you're facing. We're committed to ensuring that our clients get tangible and sustainable results. And that's really kind of our goal through the whole process. So with that, let's see if there's any questions. Nicole, any questions out there that I can handle?
Let me see. All right. Having some issues here. Okay, so from Andrew Kester. So far, the simulation has covered a handful of SKUs. So does your system allow for the automation via DDMRP for, say, 40K items on a monthly basis?
Yep. Yeah, good question. Absolutely. I was using an item by item simulation, but that same engine can do your whole portfolio. In fact, I don't think we mentioned it on the session previously with Barry, but we're actually using that same engine to send out concentrate requirements to the concentrate side of Coca-Cola so that they have a supply signal that they can utilize. They get great value on that. And, yeah, we've got clients with much larger item counts than 40,000 that are utilizing that software. And all of that's done with order policies, all of those elements in mind.
All right, we have another question. How do you handle large swings in lead time that are due to the nature of the product? Example, a box manufacturer runs a large amount of boxes, but stores them and releases when asked. The lead time is short when they have stock still in the store, but long when they have to rebuild.
Great question. We're very familiar with this. One of our clients is Jamestown Container that's in the packaging business and Greif as well. Yeah, in certain cases like that, they are holding stock for you and then they'll ship as you require those. It's kind of an interesting question. Your lead time should be set at the reliable response that you expect from your vendors. I think the key here in this scenario that you're talking about, where they may have a capacity constraint of their own, is that if you're giving them a reliable signal based on kind of the concentrate example I just shared that Coca-Cola utilizes, then I would be holding their feet to the fire to make sure that they're going to be able to meet their service level commitments to you. It should not really be an issue of the lead time. So I think it's more about sharing visibility. In fact, we have customers that are, because it's a cloud-based solution, giving access to some of their vendors so that they can monitor the buffer positions of the items they supply to that client. And it really helps build a collaborative environment for both yourself as well as your suppliers to ensure that you're on the same page in terms of what your requirements may be. I see another question here from Andre. Exception management. That's a pretty broad term, Andre, but I am a big believer in the following, that I think the system should be able to do most of the work for us. And unfortunately, that's not the case in most environments, especially if you've got older ERP technology. And so we are all about exception management. In fact, what we are trying to show, like with that rough cut capacity planning, is if items are not having issues, don't look at them. Let them, you don't need more work to do, honestly, in your day. So we're all about highlighting, your planning priorities are on an exception basis. Most of the items on a given day don't need to be paid any attention to. And so the bias of our system and what we're trying to do is make it easier to have fewer exceptions, but also when they do occur, that you can see them and respond to them accurately. I use this analogy all the time, that I can fly to Europe to go meet with clients over there, knowing that the pilot is rarely flying the plane. They'll get involved on exception basis, but the system's doing the job, right? And why is it we can't get inventory planning and material planning to a more modern level like that? I mean, my God, there's nobody's lives are at stake. I know some people feel that way at times when things are going haywire, but we should be able to get to a much more stable and operationally simple environment by really doing a better job, by taking that forecast and putting it down and saying we're going to pace to the real demand, and knowing that we've engineered the system to do that, to me is the game changer. It's like, SpaceX landing a rocket on its tail and reusing it. Now, all of a sudden, once we can prove that we can do that over and over again, the game changes and we look at our supply chain in a much, much different manner. Okay, I think that is it for questions. So thanks so much, everyone, for attending. Hopefully you'll find this of interest. Again, we'll be distributing the presentation materials and a link to the recording that you can access. We greatly appreciate your interest. If you want to come see us in Atlanta here in May, we'd love to see you. So we want to wish you all the best. Thanks again for coming, and good luck on your own demand-driven journey. Thanks, everyone.